A cultura é um dos mais preciosos instrumentos de democracia. É um canal de expressão plural que permite a convivência de diferentes vozes, histórias e visões de mundo. E por isso a cultura, tal qual a democracia, deve ser defendida e fortalecida. Essa é a função da Lei Rouanet, a principal política pública de incentivo à cultura brasileira. Com ela, perseguimos a missão de assegurar o acesso democrático à produção e à difusão cultural. Ao longo de mais de 3 décadas, a Rouanet permitiu que inúmeras iniciativas culturais, antes inviáveis, ganhassem o mundo. Revelou histórias, preservou tradições e transformou vidas. Lei Rouanet, há 33 anos tornando a cultura brasileira mais plural, acessível e democrática.
Casal de dançarinos se olham sorridentes. Uma banda orquestrada para de tocar. Logos: Lei Rouanet, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução.
Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. No poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. É valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Eu, para o meu filho, para a criança, para todo mundo, como é que faz remédio domado para a criança, para beber, né? A gente tira a raiz, a folha, para cozinhar, para tomar. Remédio para febre e dor de cabeça também.
E às vezes a gente não consegue alcançar, né, o conhecimento. E eu sempre procurei entender com os pajés, né, com os mais velhos, e eu sempre estava ali presente em cada ritual que eles faziam. E hoje eu tenho um pouco desse conhecimento. É claro que tem muita coisa que eu devo aprender ainda, né, mas eu sempre repasso esse conhecimento para o jovem, até porque a minha preocupação maior é de fazer com que os jovens sempre mantenham, né, o nosso conhecimento, a nossa cultura, a nossa tradição. Esse é o foco principal da minha luta, né?
Porque aqui, né, toda criança fala só Guarani, né? E adulto também, porque não está acostumado a falar só português, não fala não. É por isso que a criança, adulto também não esquece de falar.
Eu como mulher, como mãe, avó, essa é a minha luta.
Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 23ª FLIP, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A FLIP conta com o benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 235060, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiências física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Jequitibá do Nubank. Patrocínio Figueira da Vale. Patrocínio Guapuruvu do Itaú e da Motiva, por meio do seu instituto. Patrocínio Cedro do Sesc, da MAC Móveis e de O Globo. Patrocínio Araribá, da Globo Livros. Apoio institucional da Prefeitura de Paraty, Governo do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, IFAM, Instituto do Patrimônio Histórico e Artístico Nacional e Museu do Território. É uma criação e realização Associação Casa Azul e Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. FLIP, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Is supporting this roundtable, and I would like to remind you that you can watch online on YouTube and on the RT1 channel the activities taking place here. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and there will be a team in the room that will bring you some uh, pen and paper so that you can write down your questions, and the authors will be next to this tent on the Flip bookstore signing their books. And it is very important to remember those that are making a huge effort to recount history in the right way, and the work of those two intellectuals is very important because they dismantle myths that don't help us in any way to move away from the place in which we are, and I thank them every day for explaining it and letting us understand history, and not to the two guests, but also Juliana Borges, which is a part of the Moderators Union. She is the third one that will help us understanding this history in a better way. Ju, I'm going to say good afternoon, even though she said good morning. And of course, she is unveiling the existence of the Union of Moderators. But I would like to start by thanking again Flip for the invitation to be here, by thanking Mauro Munoz, Artistic Director, and also my dear friend and curator, Ana Cecilia, who believes that I am able to moderate this conversation. And I would like to start by inviting to the stage Ynaê Lopes dos Santos. Welcome, Ynaê. Ynaê, who was born in Sao Paulo. She has a master's and a PhD in history from the University of São Paulo. She's a writer, curator, columnist, and professor of history of America at the Fluminense Federal University. Her research areas deal with the history of slavery and ethnic racial relations in the Americas. She published the books Além da Senzala, Ranchos Escravos de Moradia no Rio de Janeiro from 1808 to 1850. História da África e do Brasil Afrodescendente, Juliana Moreira, o médico negro na Fundação da Psiquiatria Brasileira, Brazilian Racism, Racismo Brasileiro, uma história da formação do país, and this year she's launching Irmãs do Atlântico, Atlantic Sisters, Slavery and Urban Spaces in Rio de Janeiro and Havana. And I now invite to the stage Tiago Rogero, please. Tiago was born in Belo Horizonte and he lives in the city of Rio de Janeiro. He's a journalist and he's a correspondent of the Guardian newspaper in South America. He's the creator and coordinator of a Quirino project launched as a narrative podcast and winner of the Vladimir Herzog Journalistic Award in 2023. Later, he released the book Projeto Quirino, an Afrocentric look at the history of Brazil, which won the APCA Award in 2024 in reportage biography category. He's also the creator and host of the narratives podcasts Vidas Negras, a finalist at the 2021 Third Coast International Audio Festival in the Best Non-English Language Documentary category, and Negra Voz, winner of the Vladimir Herzog Journalistic Award in 2020 in the Audio Journalistic Production category. So welcome, and what a CV they have, both of them. But I would like to start by reminding you that the mirror is not always a tool for vanity. It is many times a confrontation artifact in a country that insists in looking aside as like pretending not to see itself in full. There is a risk of remaining stuck in its own illusion. At this roundtable, Brazil in the Mirror, we are not interested in the reflex, made-up reflex of official ephemerides, but the opposite of the portrait, the silences and the deleted stories and distortions of a history that is told from whiteness. And Paraty is a city that has in its streets and stones the signs of a slaving Brazil and a resistant one that invites us to listen and to rethink history and the history of the country. And I would like to start talking about this radical proposal that you both share, that of recounting, retelling the history of Brazil. And the title of the table, Brazil in the Mirror, comes from the idea that we have a national image which is very distorted, and in which a group appears at the center, and racism as a deviation that, and you were always provoking in your books, is it a deviation? Is it a failure or a fault? So what happens and what should we happen or expect when Brazil looks at itself face to face with no filter, no makeup? And why is it many times difficult to look at yourself in the mirror? Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and even more so surrounded by people that I admire so much as Tiago and Juliana, to address this very important topic. And I believe that this question brings in itself some a feeling of urgency. It has been built for so long by Black movements, and it is a moment of revering these movements and these characters that over our history, they've been showing us that we live in a certain way a fake history, a Brazil that believes to be a straight line when it is in fact a very complex web of relations. And I know Tiago's work, and I know that he also tries to unveil this complexity which is Brazil. And the ugliest face of this complexity is racism, which is a structuring element in Brazilian society, both in terms of the multiple kinds of violence experienced by indigenous and black population, but also in the privileges that the white population has, and we naturalize it. We naturalize both sides of it. So we need to look at those structuring aspects of racism in a more acute way, in a sharper way, in a critical way, and with a hammer in our hand to try to dismantle it. And Tiago, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with two people that I admire and I like very much. I think that the result of Brazil looking in the mirror, which is something that did not happen yet. There are many efforts in this sense, but it did not happen in at all. The image in the mirror is not something that's going to be beautiful, and Brazil is not ready to see it. I'm a journalist and I work for The Guardian as a correspondent, and I was in Curitiba. And we are going to speak of it when we speak of Leminski. And I was there recently to to cover some Cubans that are coming to Brazil. And for the first time, there are more Cubans asking for refuge in Brazil than Venezuelan people. And one of the things that Brazilians like to say, differently from Europeans and North Americans, people say that Brazilians are warm and they take you in their arms and etc. And so every Cuban person I talked to said that what shocked them the most was how closed Brazilians are. And why are Brazilians closed? Are Brazilians closed to everyone? Are they closed? Are they refractory to the Europeans that come? No, usually it's very easy for them to mingle, but for immigrants, Spanish speaking with black phenotypes, and imagine like Haitians and Africans that come to Brazil, it is more difficult. And I had never heard that Brazilians are not open-hearted and welcoming, but from the standpoint of a Cuban migrant coming here, even with a complete higher education, they're not able to validate their diploma and they're not able to work in the jobs for which they studied, and that's it. There is naturally racism in there. It's a deeply violent country with a deeply violent history. Ynaê addresses it very much, and Project Querino taps very much into what Ynaê brings, and so there is a journalism, an intellectual, and a journalist that used very much the knowledge brought by this intellectual to develop Project Querino. And of course, in the history that we learn at school, the process of independence and the importance of July 2nd in Bahia, and this year the federal government recognized it, and we learn it as if the independence of Brazil were something like sudden. One day they decided that Brazil was independent, or it was like just a simple ritual, but that's not the case. Many people died. There was a lot of violence in the process, and this image of Brazil reflected in the mirror is much uglier than most of Brazilians want to admit. Of course, there are many good aspects too. I'm not saying that Brazil is only made of horrible aspects, but there are many ugly things, and we are able to address them more and more. Just before going to the next question, I made a mistake because today is Friday Oxalá Day, and I think it is very important on a day like this to mention this important point. And moving to another question, you propose a historical reading not only in Racismo Brasileiro, Brazilian Racism by Ynaê, but also in the Querino project by Tiago, a long-lasting reading and how racism structures itself is a logic of social organization in Brazil. It wasn't a failure, and it organizes Brazilian society. And in Querino, this retelling comes in layers. So we are led into a journey in which we address slavery abolition and the republic, and I would like you to talk about those aspects, and I believe that you both explore it in a very interesting way. What were the events that lead to the abolition, or as black movements say, the incomplete abolition, but this A story is always told, as Tiago said, as having been something simple, just of writing on a paper, but there were also some stories of revolts and rebellions, and this is very much deleted from what we learn. And how was it to build those works, not only denouncing the gaps, but also proposing new ways of telling history and bringing other elements to the surface? And how was the decision process? And this aspect I would like to explore. For abolition, what was the process? The move from imperial to republican Brazil, which is very much connected to the current moment. There is a class, usually an oligarch, a class of oligarchs that end up deciding for the country's directions. And I think that the first condition to make choices was to start from the assumption that racism is a power system that organizes modernity. So from the moment society in different parts of the globe connected through a process of European colonization, racism started operating, and racism is also historically determined. The racism in the 16th century is not different from the 17th century racism and different from the 18th century racism, but it is a racism that continues to operate and uses this abstraction and continues to operate in the world, and bringing the idea of human races to define which place the subjects are going to occupy. This was the assumption of denunciation, especially in Brazilian racism, racismo brasileiro. It was a purpose of the book to denounce this approach. And we usually separate the history of black people in Brazil very much as if it weren't connected to the history of Brazil, the country itself. And from that point on, another dimension that was very important for me was to make, let's say, to play with the macro structure and micro history. The macro structure was within this denunciation structure dimension, and we learn as moments of writing something or signing something, and there is a permanence, a racist permanence in Brazil, the abolition of slavery, as you mentioned, but also the process of independence. All of the acute moments in Brazil, in history of Brazil, are moments of agreeing again around racism and keeping racism in Brazil. And there are some dissonant voices which are not so dissonant. There are many black subjects that were resisting. There has always been black subjects resisting from the moment the first black was enslaved and brought to the country. But bringing some of the dynamics of these subjects that are a little more known by a wider audience is important, not to fall into the mistake that the history of black resistance started in the Republic, which is not true, because there is a plethora of cases of resistance in Brazil, which is part of the history of Brazil. My idea was always bringing this kind of approach, but bringing light on this aspect of denunciation of racism that organizes our society. Well, I'm going to explain very briefly what Project Quirino is. It was a Brazilian journalistic project launched in 2022, the result of 2 years and 7 months of more than 40 people working together. Ynaê made part of it, and it was launched as a podcast, which is available for free with sign language interpretation available, and a series of publications in the Piauí magazine, a podcast produced by the Radio Novelo podcast, supported by the Birapitanga project. And then Fósforo Publishing House invited me to write a book on the project, and I spent a year writing about it, and we've launched it recently. It is a news, well, actually a reporting book. And the idea is that it is an accessible book for everyone in the good sense of the word. It's not condescending or patronizing, but it tries to be very direct and address information in a very straightforward way. And then something that's very interesting, apart from the collaboration of all those people and our intellectual and spiritual guide in Ynaê, is the fact that it is a journalistic project, and I like to say that I'm not a historian, I am a journalist, and it helps that the fact that I did not know most of the information that are in the Quirino project, and which is the case for most of the population, leaving aside historians. And I didn't know a lot of things, like I didn't know that most of the people who were still enslaved in 1888, most of them, and I'm speaking of many people, they were people that, according to the laws in Brazil at the time, were illegally kept as slaves for decades. And I didn't know that the process of abolition in Brazil was not just the signing of a paper by a benevolent princess. Brazil was in the verge of a civil war, and things were going down the drain in the country, and then many white people took part in the abolition movement, but there were many enslaved people escaping in Brazil, and many black people also actively participating in the abolition movement, and they forced Princess Isabel to sign the abolition document, and her father, Dom Pedro II, who was away for health issues. Well, he later admitted that if it were him, he would not have signed it. And so it was the result of many elements that got together, and I was finding it out, and it's the process of choosing the elements and the information we were going to convey in our project was like this, be it in the podcast or in the articles published in the magazine. And they are contents and pieces of information that had been produced for decades. We don't bring any new piece of information in Quirino project, and we also refer to the person who got the information, produced the information. But Brazil as a whole, and the intelligentsia in Brazil, the intellectuals in Brazil, the white intellectuals, they prevent this knowledge to reach people, because of course it helps keeping the power for those who are in power.
I would like, Ynaê, to talk about the launch of Irmãs do Atlântico, Sisters of the Atlantic. I'm absolutely adoring this book. It's so interesting. Ynaê is making this, is a storytelling, a timeline of the creation of two cities, which are Havana and Rio de Janeiro. They are cities of ports, of merchandise, of people, of black bodies, of agency, reinvention, and it's such a pleasure to read, because it's like a discovery to understand these different relations. And also, it is a provocation. It's food for thought. When we talk about enslavement in Brazil, we try to find a comparison or a dialogue with the United States. These are experiences of colonization, racism, which are quite distinct from the Brazilian experience. So we have to revisit this dialogue. It is interesting to do so with other Latin American territories from the Caribbean, and we have to remember that we are Latin Americans, all of us, Amero-Latinos. So this allows us to disassemble this illusion of Brazil being exceptional. When we talk about enslavement, that was less violent, that it was a harmonious mixing of races. So I would like you to address a little bit your perspective of how it was, how you came to the decision to establish this parallel between Rio de Janeiro and Havana, how you developed this process to create this idea of exceptionalism and to establish dialogues. And just aside here, I talked to Ynaê when I was reading. I remembered conversations I had with a friend of mine from Pará, from the state of Pará, and she always says that, how couldn't you know this? She highlights my ignorance, because she lived in São Paulo for 15 years. And she does not accept certain things. And she would talk about the discussion between what happened in Pará, in the Grão Pará, and the so-called cabanagem movement. And she said, did you know that there was a leadership between the cabanagem movement and leaderships that thought about the revolts? And I said, no, I had no idea. No, but there are documented history that two of them came to Brazil. They did the exchange. So this wealth of information that is sometimes forgotten, erased. So if you could talk to us about a bit more of that. It's good to know. Well, Irmãos do Atlântico, Sister of the Atlantic, I'm launching here at Flip, and I'm so happy, and I'm launching it through the publishing house Civilização Brasileira. It is a result of my PhD thesis. I wanted to understand how the two largest enslavement cities worked, Rio de Janeiro and Havana. And when I studied from 1773 to 1843, there's a rival. There's a moment of rivalry that Havana has more enslaved people, and then Rio de Janeiro, because of Brazil and the strong relation that Brazil has with slave trafficking, because there were Brazilian trade traffickers, and it becomes the largest slavery city in the world. So this comparison happened because of a concept. And it's a very important concept that we have to work here, and will help us disassemble certain ideas. It is a concept that, according to slavery, it was created by David Thomas, a professor in the U.S., and the assumptions that in the 19th century, and especially after the Haitian Revolution, a revolution that will truly change the perception you had on the enslaved population. It is the first and only revolution of enslaved people that is successful, creating the Second Republic of the Americas, the first without slavery in 1804. This is a revolution that is 30 years. It was 91 to 1804. I have to stop. I love to talk about the history of Haiti, but there's so much we have to learn with it. But it will cause a great fear among the classes and the slave owners. And there's a change in the formation and the unfolding of this at that moment. What we see is that 3 different places in the Americas will place their bets in slavery, and the rest of Latin America, basically, the whole will abolish slavery as the independence process will happen. And these 3 places that keep enslavement are, respectively, Brazil, Cuba, and U.S. And keeping enslavement that is related to the process of the Industrial Revolution in the U.K. So it only happened because there was slavery happening. So this also allows us to observe, and capitalism is, of course, a lot more complex than what we imagine. There are many more things, including slavery. So what I wanted to establish was a relation that would be based on this common ground of this idea of societies in which the elites will maintain slavery when you already have very strong abolitionist statement or rhetoric. And from England, the largest enslavement country in the world, but does a turnaround because of the revolution in Haiti. But these 3 places don't have slavery, and Brazil and Cuba will do it through trafficking. The U.S. has another story, a bit different, but Brazil and Cuba will continue to be in this map because of trafficking. But Cuba in 1886 and Brazil 1888. So these are 2 territories that reorganize themselves, and here I'm going to use this sentence by Luis Felipe de Alencastro, to place their bets on the future of slavery. So I wanted to understand what was the purpose behind that, this urban space in which enslavement is not recognized, but it's actually very central to that life. We're talking about slavery cities that depend on slavery to work. So this was quite interesting, and to see this negotiation between the elites. They are understanding each other. You know, the Cuban elite is thinking about what the Portuguese elite is doing, and is also thinking about what the Brazilian elite is doing. So there is this ownership, the Brazilian ownership, that sometimes only this connection between the U.S. and Brazil that goes beyond, and it is a lot more complex and deep than what we normally consider. So I just got one snapshot of this complexity to work also with this space, which, to my understanding, is also a provocation. There are not that many urban studies that will recover and revisit the weight that slavery and enslavement had in the space of the cities. Many of the cities, especially in Brazil, cities that were considered, that had other meanings. So I wanted to bring these other possibilities of freedom based on the experience of enslaved people. Wonderful. When I read this book, I wanted to go to Cuba, but I haven't had the opportunity. Now I'm going, I said. No, everybody should go. It has to do with our history. If I could allow me, Juliana, I would like to bring this to our times. There is this migration issue happening in Brazil now, as we heard with the Cuba issue. And for now, we haven't have the approach of the Brazilian authorities yet. The migration of Venezuelans into Brazil continues to be intense, but the number of Cubans is much larger than Venezuelans for the first time in history. This started last year because of the financial crisis in Cuba, power crisis, and this year it has intensified. And one of the reasons is the fact that there is a dictator in the U.S. now, and he closed all forms of entry, so Brazil becomes an alternative. However, the people who are coming to Brazil, since Brazil prepared in a certain way to receive the Venezuelans, creating facilitated ways of becoming refugees, the Venezuelans were able to find a certain insertion, which the Cubans are not yet able. In order to, for instance, have the number of refugee requests, and the only way of having a formal work is taking like sometimes 6 months. So it's 6 months a person that is graduated as a journalist, as myself, a physician, an architect, or so even someone that has no graduation, no college, this person will be 6 months exposed to odd jobs and to be enslaved in a modern slavery. And the Brazilian government is not preparing. I asked this week for the Ministry of Justice, the Justice Department, if there's going to be any change, any kind of facilitation for the Venezuelans, as we had in Venezuela. And there's not. So our brothers, our Cuban brothers, are not being well treated by our country. Just to talk about this is something that is happening today, and it's going to be one of the issues we have this year. Yes, certainly, you're right. I guess there's in your production, it's always to say that we are not talking about black issues, black problems, the issue regarding black people, but how Brazil built itself as it is. And this is a topic that belongs to all of us, not only black people. So when you choose to tell the story from this standpoint, what are the most common reactions you are confronted with? Are those who still think that this is something that is that divides Brazil, that we should overcome it in a different way? What do you feel? How bothered do you believe people are by this conversation? Well, we have reactions. Projeto Quirino, the podcast, was very successful. The book is also selling. So I get many messages from readers, from our listeners, but the public that consumed is a representative of the Brazilian population, mostly black, but maybe 50%. So of course, it's such a pleasure to have the positive reactions. And I wrote this book for everyone because I believe it is for everyone. But what I really, truly love is when a black person tells me that the book helped that person to move forward with life, to feel empowered or better about their life, to understand our importance in the creation of the country. But I also receive messages from white people, and sometimes I'm a bit surprised, and this happens quite frequently, with people that believe that now they can walk around with an anti-racist badge. And as I said, well, it's 2 years, 7 months of 40 people working. It is awarded, and I'm very proud of it. It's a very good product. And it's similar to what things in the international journalists. So, you liked it. So now it's a badge of honor. Do you think that you're doing a favor because you like it? No, you liked it because it's good. So, but there are those who act like that, and many of these people think that because they like Projeto Quirino, they have a power over me, and which I can't understand it. It's a very enslaved kind of thought. But anyways, this is one of the things that happens as a reaction. But this whole idea of racism, of course, the black people, of course, are the ones that are hit heavily by racism. They have no right to live. They have no right to the basic conditions of life. And even in the best day, everything is going well. Your team won the championship in Brazil. Everything is going well. And then one experience of, well, Galo won from Flamengo yesterday, beat Flamengo yesterday. So the experience of racism that is always very cruel might do away with this. So racism, of course, hits black people more. But the greater responsibility of solving this is on the white people, because they are the ones who benefited from racism. It's something I always try to stress, is that a country in which all the people have similar conditions of developing themselves, wouldn't it be a better country for everyone? It would be a country without, the issues regarding security. It would be a country with a better education, with scientific wealth, not wealth, but if it's a neoliberal, it could be money. We will have also more money too. So, but we are always confronted with the issue that is a colonial issue. It is a fact that when Brazil, for instance, during slavery, could have evolved in its industry, it didn't, because the slave owners didn't want to give away, didn't want to lose that feeling, feeling of wealth that they felt by having slaves. So I rather have more profit here than share it a little bit better, maybe prepare my team so that everybody can grow together. And this is the thought that remains to this day. I guess this happens more with professors. I work a lot with education and training of trainers, of professors, and many schools, especially private schools, have gone through the movement of, talking about racism. And Tiago brought something that I find very important. Anti-racism is not a place where we're going to go. It is the path we will follow. And it's important that people, white people, who truly wish to take this path, have this understanding, because racism is unfortunately creating what we believe is natural or normal, what we actually believe and follow. We might be sad, or because most part of the population in Brazil, poor population in Brazil, is black, but we do nothing. And if they were white people, we truly would have some kind of movement to support this, like how media will talk about black youngsters linked to drug trafficking or not, and sometimes not even linked to drug trafficking. The way we understand Brazilian society, the way we understand our own societies, are completely formatted by racism. What I hear from black people is that there's a relief that, we're together, we're hand in hand, we're working together because we need to be together, and we've been together for many years. But we need to say this and reinforce this all the time. And there's something that I find quite interesting, especially for those who work with education, intellectuals, professors, educators, is how do we go about this? Because we already understand the issue, we have racism. So how do we go about this? So the question is, now what? But we don't have a single answer to that question. And I guess this is one of the main issues, one of the main dilemmas that we have in dealing with racism. It's not a simple issue. It is very complex. It is deep. It is what we understand of being normal. So to change this, you can't just listen to Projeto Querida. I believe everyone should listen to it, of course. I'm going to say this. When I was doing my consultancy, but everything was prepared by Tiago, and he did it beautifully. And I remember reading, because I read all the scripts, and then after listening to it, and he's like a genius in the sense he can use a dimension of our experience that we sometimes forget, even though it's so part of our life, which is orality, which is deeply Afro-Brazilian and indigenous Brazilian. And he did this so well. I remember crying. I'm not a person who cries easily, but it's as if I was, detached from what I was reading and with a critical approach of what I was actually listening. And here, for those who have not listened, do so because it's so good. Projeto Quirino, the podcast. And there is this dimension of what we can do. And what we can do depends on each one of us, who you are in the world. We have to, I'd love to bother people. I'm the discomfort queen. I want to cause discomfort on white people. They don't like it, I know. But I want them to think about this, and I want them to have this in their minds, echoing in their minds. And I agree with Tiago. It's a rude awakening, racism. If you stop to think very coolly about that, we know so many people. The world is worse. There are a number of oppressions around the world. We're unable to advance in science. We can even imagine that there is a problem because the problem does not hit white people or maybe black people, but for some specificity. And sometimes, or most of the time, it is mostly social economic issue, but it's always seen from a racial bias. And we know less black authors, less art by black artists. So we become stupid, we become ignorant if that happens. So if on one hand it is horrible, and sometimes it is desperation when you think about the size of racism in Brazilian society. On the other hand, to know the paths that people have historically taken, people who are not in a privileged position, it is very positive. It is mostly the artists, men and women, have this very important role to bring us some relief, to allow us to dream, even in a world that was created for us to be in the senzala, in the slave quarters.
Eu vou.
Well, I'm now going to use some of the questions that came from the audience, and it adds to one that I had thought about. The question is, how do you assess the impact of the positive action policy in the public education? Besides democratizing access, do you believe that the education is really transforming itself? What is it to be a black woman in the space of university? And this links to a question that I had thought of, because I think that you were already bringing elements that say how much this is a challenge that needs to be overcome. But if, especially now after Obama, in the United States, there was this idea that we were living a post-racial era. The access to university also makes people think that, okay, this is already moving on, we cannot go back in that. And I would like you to talk a little bit about this issue when questioning this idea that there has been a turning of events, especially in also the quest for reparation, and also the dimension of risks, the risks that we still face of being engulfed by those logics and dynamics if we are not alert, if we do not have the perspective that you mentioned, that anti-racism is just a path that we haven't gotten anywhere yet. So, and there's a lot to be debated. Okay. I think that the education quotas was one of the most transformative things that we've seen in the education in Brazil, and it is the result of the Black movement actions. I studied in a public university, an excellence one of the few black students during my university years, and as I went up to my master's and my PhD, I saw less and less black people, and nowadays I am a professor at the university, and I am the only black professor at my department. And so I uh, many times I live this paradox. So if Ynaê is capable, well, if Tiago is capable of getting somewhere, so everyone is. But what I see today, what I experience today as a public university professor is a university that wasn't like mine. And I am very happy because we see over 45% of black students, male and female, in the public university, and this is very moving, and it brings many interesting dimensions because the questions that the students bring in class are completely different from my times in university. I had a student, and I work with the 19th century. I lecture on the 19th century, and I had a black student, a girl, and she came to me and said, "Oh, I'd like to study a period which is not covered by what you lecture about, but I was told that my topic is not a topic of history, and for me, there is nothing out of history. So there's nothing that is not history. History is everywhere." We'll say, "But what do you want to study that they told you was not history?" "I would like to study the unionization of domestic workers in the city of Rio de Janeiro." Well, if this isn't history, what is history? Yes, of course, I told her. Of course, it is not into the period I work with. But she was asking this question because she was the daughter, the granddaughter, the great granddaughter of um, uh, domestic workers, and she's the first generation to break up with this exclusion cycle, and the breakup is very hard to be maintained. One thing is to access university, but another thing is to leave university because it is not yet a totally inclusive space, and we need permanence policies, and we need to bring it to the core of the discussion on higher education in the country, how to keep those students at university. But no doubt, I would say that I am radically for quotas and affirmative actions. And we need to change now the life of black people. And of course, it is also important to think on short-term and a long-term action. The public education in Brazil is it is not by chance that the public education in Brazil has been depleted by society and by the state, because it is an access point for especially the black population and the poor population, and it is a political project which is dismantling public education, and the university has the role of making um, people remain in this space. And again, it's very difficult. Many students quit university because they need to work, and some colleagues, they sometimes they understand this dynamics of people that need to work and that have kids, and there are a series of aspects. But I can say that it was the most positive transformation I've seen in Brazil due to the implementation of anti-racist politics or policies. And of course, there is no anti-racism without income redistribution, which is totally crucial. And we need to also make sure that the generations of young people and the same generation which is killed by the police in the country, well, we want to make sure that they wish to access university. And I am a radical defensor of the quotas, and it needs to be expanded because it is paramount for Brazil to move on. And as Ynaê said, it is important to say that the quota and the affirmative action is a result of black movement actions. Now it benefits white people who are not able to enroll in private schools, and also people with um, many kinds of people are benefited by these quotas. And there is a a lie, which is widespread, that quotas should be social and they are not social, but they are social. The first aspect is a social aspect, and then later there are other aspects that count on being eligible for an education quota. When the Japanese started to occupy the Liberdade neighborhood in Sao Paulo, the Black Front that existed in this place welcomed the sons and daughters of the Japanese in their schools, because the Japanese children were not welcome in the elite schools, and they're still treated differently. And so many people say that this anti-racist movement is a movement that generates separation, but that's not the case. We are working towards having a more integrated and inclusive country. And so going back to Juliana's question, if it is granted, no, of course, FLIP's program is very diverse, and there are many names, and we are going to have Minister Marina Silva, who is a light-skinned black woman, and there is nothing granted, nothing is taken for granted, because the Brazil only recently, with the death of a black man in the United States, found out that there is racism around the world. Brazil, a country in which police officers kill black people like more than once a week everywhere, Brazilians were shocked, and that's what motivated Ynaê to write Racismo Brasileiro, Brazilian Racism, the book. And the country is very much working on dropping diversity off, and it's already started, because now we have this movement in the United States encouraging companies to stop their diversity programs. And here in Brazil, and I've talked to some people that said it hasn't yet arrived here, but I cannot imagine that companies that have been super anti-racist, and the moment they realize they can stop doing it, those companies are going to stop doing it, because this change is going to happen in the board of those companies, and only when there is a representative number of black, indigenous, or minority groups represented there. We know how expensive it is to be at FLIP, or to come to FLIP, and it will be interesting to see the moment we have 50% of black people in the audience here, which is not the case today. And again, nothing against the white people who are here. Thank you for being here. That's it. I am a visibly mixed man. My family is white and black, but this week there was an example that shocked the country. A Brazilian newspaper that was celebrating 100 years, and I worked at this newspaper before, and I like it very much, and I respect many people that work in this newspaper. And this week they announced 19 new columnists, or 21 new, and they used in the title a new diversity of content, and all of the new writers in the newspaper, none of them is black. And this is something happening every day. I read the newspapers and the news, and I do this exercise of scanning what the newspapers are writing about, and they've been focusing on events and lectures and etc. to raise funds, and it's very seldom we see black people in those papers. Usually they are men, and it's very difficult to find one black person. This is happening today, so there is nothing granted or solved, and this is a 100-year-old newspaper and working based on a past mentality and or mindset. The moment they realize that it is possible to drop the inclusion and diversity programs, they're going to do it. So this fight needs to continue all the time. It needs to increase, actually, because we are very far away. Are we talking too much about racism? No, it's too little, because people are still dying, like boys that leave home to go to work and they are killed because they are mistaken by outlaws. And so why? It's not the case that they are mistaken by outlaws. It's simply the case that their lives matter less. And so while all of this is happening and we do not have an actual representativeness and then the possibility of giving the possibility for everyone to live, to dream, to also have access to wealth. And of course, it's not only an entire life of hard work to, you know, if we haven't gotten there, nothing was solved. Can I add something? I did not answer this part of the question, just to add to what Tiago was saying brilliantly. I think there is another crucial dimension that you brought in your question. We also need, on this path of anti-racism, we need to tackle historical reparation, which needs to be symbolic but also material, it also financial. We are speaking of people who pay for the burden of a power system in which they are a mass of workers that were excluded from the condition of having capital, so which is in the capitalist system. That's what matters, and we do not have it here in Brazil. I'm not in favor of capitalism like that, but that should be granted to everyone. And in the world, around the world, and thinking of anti-racism, we need that the power is also in the hands of black people. So as much as representativeness is important, very important, and it's very nice to see kids today. My daughter saw Conceição Evaristo, the author, black woman author, Brazilian author. She was like very happy to see, to know that the lady is one of the greatest intellectuals in the country. But we need to change the material conditions of life of those black people and indigenous people and etc. And this is a collective responsibility in relation to what racism is. And we need to improve, to fine-tune our actions. And as Tiago said, black movements have been fighting for it for centuries, and we are not going to stop until we see equity for everyone, equality, as we say in the black movement. No step backwards, only steps forward. So going back to the matter of accountability and reparation, because I have another question here, but I'm time concern here. So there is a question that I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask it first. As the author of this flip, I would like to bring Leminski into the conversation, because maybe this is also a relationship which is not evident for everyone, because Leminski was extremely political in his work, and he self-defined himself. He self-defined in a provocative way as Afro-Polish, an Afro-Polish man, he would say. But this self-definition, this a claim that he made, was not an adherence to the racial democracy myth. He was not doing it from this place of homogenizing and deleting, saying, oh, we are all mixed people, we are all human beings. That wasn't his intention. It doesn't seem to me, because unfortunately I couldn't meet him when he was alive, but he was not doing it to delete anything. Much the opposite. Yesterday there was a round table, and we were talking about mixity, and also Gael Fay was speaking of it, and it was very beautiful the way they brought this issue. And I think this has a link directly with Leminski, because many times this racial mixture is used in Brazil to deny racism. And it is important to understand the elements that constitute ourselves and this miscegenation. And I am a black militant and a black woman, and we are at times in which certain discourses, they are resurfacing and legitimizing backward movements. And Leminski said something that seemed to me to be very fertile. And what he says, what he does, is just saying that he can only be Leminski because he is all of this diversity, and it is this diversity that makes in such a way that he is the Leminski that we are celebrating today. So when he speaks of the biographies he wrote of Basho, Trotsky, Jesus, Cruz e Souza, oh my God, Jesus, so religiosity, mysticism, and also Cruz e Souza, and saying here that in a land no one thought one of the greatest Brazilian intellectuals was present, someone that constitutes who I am. And he wrote this biography and provoking our reflections. And I would like you to tell me, how do you read this statement by Leminski, and what does it bring to us in terms of reflections on miscegenation and how much this, instead of confounding or paralyzing us, could make us be what we really are, and how much this could take us beyond. And so I would like to go back to Leminski, who was saying that at times when people were not mentioning, and he was already provoking these reflections in this sense. I think that Leminski brought an aspect that is, in my opinion, the Brazil mode. Brazil is a mixed country. We are a mixed country, and the big issue for me, especially thinking of historical construction and the way we teach and we learn the history of Brazil, is taking miscegenation as a synonym of gentleness of the Brazilian history, because we have two myths. One is the racial democracy, which is a fallacy, but it works very well, and it helps the workings of racism. And the other myth is that we are a harmonious and peaceful society, which is not the case. Brazil's history is marked by many armed conflicts, and many times coming close to civil wars, and in some cities civil war. And so it's not simple, and we naturalize many times some dynamics of violence, and it would be interesting to stop naturalizing them. And I believe that what worked in the history of the country was bringing those two ideas together, this racial democracy and the idea that we are a harmonious and peaceful society. And then it was something that explained Brazil. There's no racism. We are mixed. I myself, I'm the daughter of a white woman, and I'm married to a white man. So what is the problem?
The problem is that we have a more hard science, genetic studies showing that the violence in Brazil is the country that has the most variety of genome. However, the matrices are black indigenous women. So this is the violence, sexual violence of these women for more than 300 years of colonization. So the issue is not to acknowledge the mixed race factor of Brazil, but it's a part of who we are. The fact is how we read and understand mixed races in Brazil, and it is the result of violence. It is the result of violence, and this violence will also change in time. Of course, the 16th century violence is not the same as the 20th century, but there are very interesting works. Leah Weine has a very interesting work about the current impact of families. A mother eventually could have a relationship, complicated relationship with her son or daughter, if the mother is white and then the children are black. So there is a dimension that is part of human experience, of our daily lives. So if I were able, in 1950, Brazil was so taken by as a possible model of mixed racedness if I may. After the Holocaust, UNESCO invested in a project called the UNESCO project to try and answer if Brazil would be or not a model of racial relations, because theoretically they were mixed races and harmonious, but so intellectuals from different parts of Brazil and the US doing research in anthropology and sociology, and then at the end of the day it was a tie. Half thought that Brazil was deeply racist, and the other half said, no, this is a racial paradise. So I guess we need to revisit this research to answer the same question, but already considering the inherent violence that constitutes our country. I guess the dynamics of applauses in this event, because you start and everybody say one starts and the others follow. It's so funny. Yeah, you're right. A baby just cried. So the whole idea of the Afro-Polish, this choice is interesting in the choice of Curitiba. Curitiba in a certain way represents Brazil in different ways, because the pole in the racial dynamics of Curitiba, I didn't know this until very recently. Curitiba is the European capital of Brazil, apparently. I'm sorry for all those from Curitiba. I guess there are many here, because it's so horrible. European capital of Brazil? That is so lame. I'm sorry if there are many people from Curitiba here, because this is idea based on these great mayors. So I also, historians from the 50s or so, there's a work about that, and they wanted to create this whole idea to differentiate Curitiba from all the rest of the country. So it's a bit of a public service, and today it's a city where everything works, there's no trash, and people only see white people when they go there, because the black people were taken out to the periphery. So in this wide dynamic, Polish are less valued, a couple of scales down, but way above a black person. And it's a very clear symptom of Curitiba, is the fact that you have all those memorials for Germans, for Italians, and there's only one dedicated to black people, which is for Zumbi dos Palmares in the outskirts of the city. So it's not part of the official tour circuit. So if you think about that, you think about Brazil and how Brazil sees itself, the reference in Brazil is Europe or US. And we imagine ourselves as descendants of Europeans, and we do not see how a black Caetano Galindo, who will be part of this program today, you probably saw other programs with him. So the fact that we speak Portuguese the way we do. Lélia Gonzalez already said that, and many other intellectuals said these are preto gays, not Portuguese, but black gays. And we have many influences from the black community and from the enslaved population. So it's an interesting symptom of Brazil. And regarding the political side, in terms of political action and not politics, institutional politics, I want to talk about institutional politics too, because this has to do with what we said here, what Ynaê said. We need to have black people, that the big black capitalists, and this is what we need. I don't know, that have black bankers. I was going to talk about something specific, but I don't need to point fingers here. But anyway, that these people that will, something that, in order to reach this, something that is in our hands that we can do, and each one of us can do, is those that can be at Flip, that can be in this auditorium. When you hire someone, a piano teacher, try to find a black one, a dentist, a physician. Try to find a black professional. I'm sure this professional exists. It might take a little bit longer. I want to have this type of shirt. Don't buy the one that you always go. Instead of buying, a book and the website that makes all the bookstores close, try to find a black person's bookshop. And next year we have an election. If each one of you decide to vote for black people, we wouldn't have a Congress that has approved And today we have super important roundtable that would approve a law, the so-called devastation law. It will be for our president to veto, but it will make the life worse for all of those who are here with us. And we are reaching the point of no return faster. And this is in your hand. In the next elections, the candidates that are available, because even the great left parties do not allow black people become candidates. So when these, please do choose black people and vote for them. Thank you. Okay, lots of tips here. So I guess.
Ah, sim, sim, tem o Quilombo do Campinho.
Oh, yes, there's the Felipe Preta, Quilombo do Campinho. I would like to close maybe talking about responsibility and reparation. We had two questions here. One of them says that we are being heard by more white people than black people. This would be like the famous mirror that will show the racial bias? Or is this a reflection that we are still failing in social and racial inclusion? And another question from Jefferson Neres. He says the black community has been doing its role in the anti-racist movement since ever. However, you think that white people have done their role in studying and understanding and exposing this whole idea of whiteness and how we build racism. In other words, are white people putting their whiteness in their mirror? I guess these two questions have to do with responsibility, liability, reparation, and maybe we want in these final minutes talk a little bit about what we need urgently to change in order to have these different institutions in Brazilian society continue stop reproducing these erasement. I'll try to be brief because I can see something blinking here in front of me. I guess there's a dynamic. There's the whiteness term, but I like white supremacy because it makes it very clear what we're talking about. And we also have a global scale that is quite evident because of what is happening in the US and also the genocide in Gaza. The idea of a white supremacy is still lacking. I guess the action of the excuse is not valid anymore. The excuses are no longer valid. We're going to say, well, it's not my fault. And in the case of, regardless of having some type of structure that will actually give the white person a condition that it did not, they did not ask to be, but they do benefit from it. So we talk about responsibility and liability. We will continue to do this, a number of actions, varied actions. However, to a certain extent, since we have more white people watching us, it has to do with a country where black people many times are unable to travel, to pay a hotel to be here. You have to pay to be here. You have to pay a hotel, whatever. So this continues to show that there's a difference but also I wish to believe that it shows that there is a part of the white population that wants to join in the fight. So this is the belief I wish to leave this stage with. This idea of being responsible, of being held liable. Where does racism touch your life? I want everyone to stop and think. I can give you many examples. So we need to think and consider that the privilege that racism gives to white people, that it will be converted into an anti-racist fight. One of the most beautiful scenes I remember from Black Lives Matter in the US was when white people did a cordon not allow people to hit or to beat black people. These are white people that know to use their privilege they have, their white bodies, to fight against racism. I guess each one has to understand what you can do. And truly, there are a number of actions. But Tiago will continue. Take it away, Tiago. 20 seconds. And this is preamble. Now I already have 15 seconds. Oh my gosh. Of course, I agree with everything that Ynaê and Juliana said. But one of the most dear points of view I have, and that we don't talk about, is financial reparation. The Brazilian state owes money to black people, and the Brazilian companies also owe money to black people. So, look at the amount of descendants of great enslavers. So many people that have buildings in Leblon, and they don't give anything back to society. People, their families were built based on the elimination of enslavement, torture of black bodies. And still today, I imagine that many of them continue to submit black people to sub-jobs and very similar to enslavement, and they still give nothing back. So it goes through financial reparation, both in the private and the public sector. So that's it, guys. That's a wrap. Record time. Tiago was able to answer. Thank you so much, Tiago and Ynaê. Thank you, Flip.
Ah, foi ótimo.